At 55, my wife left me for my best friend. She said, "He has more money than you will ever have in your entire miserable life." They got married 3 years later. I started a business with my 2 children. We're now millionaires, and they're at 55 years old, standing in my own kitchen. My wife of 30 years looked me dead in the eye and said the words that ended my marriage. "Greg has more money than you will ever have in your entire miserable life." I remember the exact time, 7:14 in the morning. My coffee was still too hot to drink. I remember thinking, in the strange sideways way your brain works during a disaster, that 30 years of marriage had come down to a sentence about money, delivered in my own kitchen, by a woman who used to make me laugh so hard I couldn't breathe. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence was only the beginning. 3 years later, I'd be worth more than either of them ever imagined. And 2 weeks after that, a plain white envelope with no return address would land on my desk and split the whole story wide open again. But let's back up, because betrayal doesn't start with a sentence. It starts with a leak you don't notice until the ceiling is in your lap. My name is Clifford Page. For 28 years, I worked commercial real estate in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I built relationships the old-fashioned way, handshake by handshake, and I was good at it. Sandra and I met in college. She was an education major with a laugh that made strangers turn their heads. We married young and built a life on Barton Shore Drive, a house with a view of the Huron River that I landscaped myself, summer after summer, on my hands and knees in the dirt because I wanted it to be ours in every sense of the word. We had 2 kids, Renee, 28, sharp as a blade, working marketing in Detroit. Troy, 25, quiet, a design mind that saw rooms the way other people see math problems. Good kids. Kids who, it turned out, would matter more to this story than I ever could have predicted. Sandra and I met in college. She laughed at a joke I made about the cafeteria mashed potatoes, and that was it for me. 22 years old and completely done for. We married 2 years later. I went into commercial real estate. She taught 4th grade for 17 years before moving into curriculum consulting for the school district. We weren't glamorous people. We were steady people. I used to think steady was the whole point of a marriage, that if you built something solid enough, nothing could tip it over. I didn't understand yet that steady things can be hollowed out from the inside without ever losing their shape on the outside. Greg Hollis came into our lives the year after our wedding. My college roommate's cousin, a landscape architect who moved to Ann Arbor with nothing but ambition and a truck full of tools. We folded him in like family. He was at every Friday poker night, every Super Bowl party. He was Troy's godfather. His wife Deborah was a pharmacist, warm, precise, the kind of woman who remembered your birthday without being asked. When Greg and Deborah separated in 2018, Sandra was there for her, comforting her, holding her hand through it. I didn't know Sandra was holding someone else's hand too. The first crack came quietly, the way they always do. Sandra started going to the gym 3 evenings a week. I told myself it was normal. We were both 50-something, both getting notices from our bodies we didn't want to read. I said nothing. I told myself I was being a good, trusting husband. Then she started sleeping with her phone. We'd always had a rule. Phones charge in the hallway, not the bedroom. One night I noticed hers missing from the charger. She said she was tracking her sleep. I nodded. I believed her because believing her was easier than the alternative. Then Greg started pulling away. Fewer poker nights, shorter texts. When I asked Sandra if she'd heard from him, she'd shrug with an ease that, looking back, was rehearsed, practiced, a performance she'd already given more than once. Then came the weekend trip. A girl's getaway, she called it. 3 nights at a lake house with 2 friends from her old teaching days. I drove her to the airport myself, kissed her goodbye at the curb like an idiot. When she got home, she was tanner than 3 days at a lake house should have made her, and there was a receipt in her jacket pocket from a hotel restaurant 2 hours in the wrong direction. I asked about it. She said her friend's card had been declined and she'd covered a meal, then forgotten to mention it. I let it go. I remember standing in the laundry room holding that receipt, my thumb running over the printed date, and some part of my chest tightened in a way I didn't have a name for yet. I folded it back into her jacket pocket and told myself I was being paranoid. I want to tell you I caught on faster. I didn't. I ignored 4 signs in a row because the alternative was standing in the wreckage of my own life, and nobody walks toward that on purpose. The morning it finally broke open, I'd come home early. A commercial deal on South State Street had fallen through, and I just wanted to be home. I walked in at 7 in the morning after an early showing cancellation, and Sandra was already at the kitchen table, coffee going cold, phone face down like a loaded weapon. Clifford, she used my full name. She only did that when she was about to deliver something I didn't want to hear. "We need to talk." I sat down. I remember my hands were steady, which surprised me later, because nothing else about that morning was. "I've been seeing Greg." The kitchen went dead silent. I asked how long. 8 months, she said, since the previous summer. I did the math instantly. While I was in Chicago at a real estate conference shaking hands and collecting business cards, my wife and my best friend of 28 years were dismantling my entire life, one secret at a time. I asked the only question that mattered. Is this over, or are you choosing him? She held my gaze like she was talking to a stranger. I'm choosing him, Cliff. Not Clifford. Cliff. Like we were already exes discussing someone else's failed marriage. Then she said it. The sentence that would follow me for the next 3 years. The one that would end up, ironically, funding everything that came after. He has more money than you will ever have in your entire miserable life. I didn't yell. I didn't break a single dish. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. The calm you get right before you decide to survive something instead of being crushed by it. She moved out within the week, into Greg's rental house on Maiden Lane, the place he'd taken after Deborah kicked him out. I called my daughter Renee that Friday night. She picked up on the second ring. When I told her, the silence lasted 4 seconds before she exploded. Greg, Troy's godfather? That man sat across from you at Thanksgiving and smiled to your face, Dad. She was at the house by Saturday afternoon. Troy drove in from campus that same night. The three of us sat on the couch, and Troy, 23 then, lanky, usually the quietest person in any room, asked one question that changed the entire shape of what came next. So, what are we going to do? Not you. We. I called Deborah Hollis 2 days later. I owed her that much. She already knew Greg had moved on. She just didn't know with whom. When I told her, the sound she made wasn't a sob. It was quieter, like watching someone deflate. I had a feeling, she said. I just didn't know who. We talked for 40 minutes. She said something before we hung up that I didn't understand yet, but would end up mattering more than either of us realized that night. He always needed an audience, Clifford. Watch how this ends when the audience gets tired of watching. I filed for divorce 2 weeks later. That's when the second escalation started. The one that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with money. I noticed it first going through our joint checking statements to prep for the divorce filing. A withdrawal in April. $12,000 wired out, labeled only personal. I told myself it was a mistake, a typo. Sandra had always handled some of our household accounts. Surely there was an explanation. Then I found another. $18,500 in June. Then $22,000 in September. The same month Greg's landscaping firm had, according to a mutual acquaintance, hit a rough patch. I sat at my kitchen table with 3 months of bank statements spread out in front of me, and my hands were not steady anymore. They were shaking so hard I had to set my coffee down. I told myself there had to be a reasonable answer, a tuition payment, a home repair I'd forgotten about. I called Sandra directly and asked her about the withdrawals. She told me flatly that it was none of my business anymore, and hung up. That was the moment I stopped rationalizing and started documenting. I hired Patricia Vance, a divorce attorney with 22 years of family law experience and a reputation in Washtenaw County for not losing. Her office was on Washington Street in downtown Ann Arbor, all glass and quiet efficiency. She looked at my bank statements for exactly 90 seconds before she looked up at me. Mr. Page, this isn't a filing error. This is a pattern. And if your wife has been dissipating marital assets to benefit a third party, meaning Mr. Hollis, that's not just a divorce issue. That's marital waste. And depending on what we find, it may be more than that. She recommended I bring in a forensic accountant before we went any further. Her name was Diane Okafor, a CPA and certified fraud examiner with 18 years of experience. Most of them spent untangling exactly this kind of thing for family law attorneys across the state. Diane's office was 2 floors below Patricia's, which felt less like a coincidence and more like a small mercy. Diane had a reputation, Patricia told me, for being the person attorneys called when a divorce case stopped being about feelings and started being about numbers that didn't add up. She requested 3 years of full account history, checking, savings, our joint retirement fund, even the home equity line Sandra and I had opened for a kitchen renovation we never actually did. It took her 11 days to build what she called a full financial map, cross-referencing every transaction against public records, vendor filings, and anything else that could put a name to a number. She called me in to review it on a Tuesday. Patricia sat in on the meeting. Diane slid a folder across the table. She called it a preliminary summary, but it read like an indictment. Mr. Page, between April and November of last year, your wife moved a total of $181,400 out of jointly held accounts. The withdrawals are documented as personal expenses, but the timing and the amounts correlate almost exactly with a series of debts owed by Hollis Landscape Architecture LLC, commercial lease arrears, an equipment loan default, and a settlement with a supplier in Ypsilanti. My stomach dropped, physically dropped, like the floor had opened under the chair. She was funding him, I said, while we were still married, while I still thought we were saving for retirement. That's what the numbers show, Diane said. I can't speak to intent. That's for the court or for a prosecutor if you choose to go that route. She walked me through the map line by line. A $12,000 wire in April, 3 days after Hollis Landscape Architecture missed a lease payment on its commercial garage. An $18,500 transfer in June. The same week Greg's equipment lender sent a default notice. Diane had pulled that notice through a public UCC filing search, cross-referenced against the bank's wire timestamp down to the hour. A $22,000 withdrawal in September, structured as 2 separate transactions 11 days apart, just under the threshold that would have triggered triggered an automatic bank compliance flag. That structuring detail matters, Diane said, tapping the page. Splitting a transfer to stay under a reporting threshold isn't something you do by accident, Mr. Page. That's someone who understood exactly what she was doing and took steps to keep it quiet. I asked her to say that again, slower, because I needed to hear it a second time before it would sit in my chest as fact instead of accusation. Patricia leaned forward. This changes your settlement position entirely, Clifford. Under Michigan law, dissipation of marital assets for the benefit of a paramour prior to the divorce being finalized can be clawed back in equitable distribution. We're not talking about a 50-50 split anymore. I sat there holding a folder that proved my wife had drained our retirement to keep her boyfriend's failing business alive while I was still sleeping in our bed every night, unaware. I asked Diane the only question I actually cared about. Can you prove this in a courtroom? I can prove it anywhere, she said. Bank records don't lie, Mr. Page. People do. Patricia's next move was to bring in Marcus Reyes, a licensed private investigator and former Ann Arbor Police Department detective with 15 years on the force before he went private. Marcus was built like a man who used to run down suspects on foot and still could. His job was simple: establish a clean, documented, legally admissible timeline of the affair itself, both for the divorce filing and to corroborate the financial pattern Diane had uncovered, because judges want more than numbers. They want a story that holds together. Marcus worked fast. Within 3 weeks, he had photographs of Sandra and Greg together at a restaurant on Main Street, time-stamped receipts showing joint purchases charged to an account Sandra swore in her deposition was for household use only, and, this was the detail that made my jaw tighten, a canceled check from Greg's failing company to a vendor, paid 2 days after one of Sandra's withdrawals cleared. 2 days. Like clockwork. He showed me his log the way a man shows you a wound he's proud he survived. Matter of fact, no drama in it. Every entry had a date, a time, a location, a note on who else was present. I don't editorialize, he told me. Judges hate editorializing. I write down what I see, when I saw it, and who can back it up if asked. He'd sat 2 tables away from Sandra and Greg at that Main Street restaurant for 90 minutes with a coffee going cold, photographing nothing more dramatic than 2 people splitting a check and laughing at something on a phone screen. But the receipt he obtained afterward, cross-referenced against Diane's withdrawal timeline, was worth more to Patricia than any dramatic photograph could have been. The boring stuff is what wins, Marcus said. Nobody contests a receipt. It's not just an affair, Mr. Page, Marcus told me over coffee near his office. It's a financial partnership dressed up as a romance. I've worked 100 of these. This one's cleaner than most. Cleaner meaning easier to prove, not cleaner meaning nicer. We built the file, bank statements, deposition transcripts, Marcus's surveillance logs, Diane's forensic report, labeled Exhibit C in the eventual filing. Patricia said it was the strongest dissipation case she'd built in years. Before mediation, Patricia scheduled Sandra's deposition, a sworn, recorded statement, court reporter and all, held in a conference room on the 4th floor of Patricia's building. I wasn't required to attend, but I did. I sat in the corner and watched my wife of 3 decades place her hand over a Bible substitute and swear to tell the truth. Patricia was surgical. Mrs. Page, can you explain the $12,000 wire transfer from your joint checking account on April the 4th? Home repairs, Sandra said. Do you have a receipt, invoice, or contractor record for those repairs? A pause. I'd have to look. Take your time, Patricia said, and let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of answer. 3 weeks before that, at a Washtenaw County Board of Realtors mixer at a hotel ballroom downtown, I'd run into Sandra and Greg by accident near the bar, both of us there for entirely separate reasons. She'd had 2 glasses of wine and clearly hadn't expected to see me. In front of 4 people I did business with regularly. She laughed and said, loud enough to carry, "Don't worry, Cliff still does fine for himself, for a man his age." Greg had the decency to look uncomfortable. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Marcus Reyes, it turned out later, had a colleague working an unrelated case in that same ballroom that night, and the exchange ended up time-stamped in a report neither of us had planned for. Small city. Small margins. Everything eventually gets written down by somebody. Then came the mediation. It was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a conference room 3 floors above a law office on Main Street. Sandra arrived with her own attorney, a heavy-set man named Roberts who had clearly not been told the full scope of what we had. Greg wasn't in the room. Michigan mediation doesn't typically involve third parties, but his fingerprints were all over every document on the table. Patricia opened by laying Diane's forensic report on the table, page by page. I watched Sandra's face as she read it. I watched the exact moment her composure started to crack, because up until that point, I don't think she believed I'd ever find it. "This is a joint account," Sandra said. "I had every right to those funds. You had every right to spend marital funds on marital purposes," Patricia said, calm as still water. "You did not have the right to systematically transfer $181,000 to prop up your boyfriend's business while your husband believed you were saving for retirement together. We have the bank records. We have the timeline. We have the corroborating surveillance. If this goes to trial, Mr. Page is entitled to seek reimbursement of the dissipated funds from the marital estate before any division occurs, meaning you would effectively be paying that money back out of your share. You can't prove I gave that money to Greg specifically," Sandra said, her voice climbing half an octave. "Withdrawals aren't a confession." "No," Patricia agreed, "but a wire transfer to your personal account followed 48 hours hours later by a payment from Hollis Landscape Architecture to a vendor in the exact same amount minus a rounding difference of $4, 3 separate times, isn't a coincidence a judge is likely to overlook. We have Ms. Okafor's report. We have Mr. Reyes's surveillance log. We have your own deposition testimony under oath where you couldn't produce a single invoice for any of the home repairs you claim these withdrawals funded. I'd encourage you to think very carefully about how this looks in front of a family court judge who takes a dim view of parties who mislead the court under oath. Roberts asked for a recess. When they came back 40 minutes later, Sandra's face had the flat, cornered look of someone doing math she didn't want to do out loud. That was the moment the mask actually slipped, not the affair, not the sentence in the kitchen. This, a spreadsheet and a folder of receipts in a beige conference room, was the moment Sandra Page stopped performing and started calculating. We settled that afternoon. I kept the house on Barton Shore Drive outright. I received the majority of what remained in our retirement accounts, adjusted for the dissipated funds Diane had documented. Sandra did not contest it further. I think she understood by then that fighting it in open court would only put more of the financial trail in front of a judge and possibly a prosecutor if I chose to pursue it criminally, which Patricia gently reminded me I still had the option to do. Patricia gave me a window. Under Michigan law, there's a limited period after a settlement is reached where a party can still refer financial misconduct for criminal review before the civil resolution effectively closes the door on it. She laid it out for me on a Tuesday, told me I had roughly 48 hours to decide before the settlement paperwork would be filed and the moment would pass. Once this is signed and filed, Clifford, going after her criminally gets a lot harder. Prosecutors don't love wading into cases that already have a signed civil settlement attached. If you want to go that direction, now's the time. I didn't sleep well those 2 nights. I sat up at the kitchen table, the same table, with the folder Diane had built spread out in front of me under the kitchen light, and I ran the numbers over and over in my head like they might change. A criminal complaint meant charges. It meant Sandra's name in the local paper. It meant Renee and Troy watching their mother get arraigned in a county courthouse. Meant years of appeals and court dates eating into a life I was trying to build, not tear further apart. My hands weren't steady those nights. I kept thinking about Deborah's line on the phone. He always needed an audience, and wondering if pursuing Sandra through a courtroom would just be handing them both a bigger one. I called Patricia back 40 hours in. I want the money back, I told her. I don't want a trial. I didn't pursue criminal charges. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't mercy. It was that I had already decided, sitting in that conference room, exactly what I wanted to do with what was left of my life, and it didn't involve spending the next 2 years in a courtroom watching Sandra's face across a table. I wanted to build something. Revenge, I'd already figured out, doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like walking away with everything that matters and never looking back. The divorce was finalized 8 months after that kitchen table conversation. I was 55 years old, legally single for the first time in 3 decades, sitting alone in a 4-bedroom house on a cold night with a view of a river I'd planted with my own hands. When I told Renee and Troy how the settlement had landed, neither of them cheered the way I half expected. Renee just nodded slowly, like she'd known all along it would come down to something like this. She always did the math on everything, Dad, she said. I guess she just finally lost one. Troy didn't say much of anything. He hugged me longer than usual and told me he was glad it was over, and I remember thinking that was the first time in months either of us had said the word over and meant it. Renee drove up from Detroit on a Saturday 2 months later. She stood in the doorway of my living room, looked at the throw pillows Sandra had picked out years earlier, the curtains, the family photos still hanging with all 4 of us in them, and she said, Dad, we need to talk about something. She slid a notepad across the table, 4 words, in her looping handwriting: residential staging and consulting. You know real estate better than anyone I've ever met, she said. Troy, on FaceTime, propped against the fruit bowl, nodded along. I know marketing. Troy knows design. We're not letting you sit in this house alone for 1 more year. I said yes before she finished the sentence. We built it from nothing. My old study became the first office. Troy shot before and after photos on a secondhand camera. Renee ran the marketing at midnight after her day job ended. I brought every real estate relationship I'd built over 28 years. Our first staged home sold in 9 days, $22,000 over asking. The calls didn't stop after that. By the end of that first year, we'd completed 31 projects and built a waiting list 12 clients deep. Renee grew our social presence to nearly 4,000 followers off nothing but honest before and after content. We lost a major contract that winter, a 10-home development deal, when the builder went with a bigger firm out of Southfield. It cost us close to $40,000 in projected revenue, and for 2 days, Troy barely spoke. I drove out to a park along the river and sat on a bench for an hour, seriously considering whether I'd made a mistake dragging my kids into this instead of just letting the wound scar over quietly. Then I drove home and told them we were expanding into virtual staging instead of retreating. By summer, it was generating 1/3 of our revenue. We didn't quit. That turned out to matter more than any single contract we ever landed. While we built, I watched, without seeking it out, because Ann Arbor is a small enough city that news finds you. Greg's landscaping firm continued to bleed out. Without Sandra's quiet infusions of cash, which had stopped the moment our divorce was finalized, and every account was frozen for review. His company couldn't cover payroll. He let his last 3 employees go before before Christmas of that year. Sandra, meanwhile, had left her curriculum consulting position sometime during the divorce. I never learned exactly why, and I made a point of not asking. What I did hear, through the kind of grapevine that exists in every mid-sized city, was that she'd gone back to substitute teaching. The woman who once told me Greg had more money than I'd ever see in my miserable life was now picking up part-time shifts to help him make rent. They got married anyway, about 3 years after that kitchen table conversation. Small ceremony, 20 guests, a rented venue out near Whitmore Lake. I heard about it from Troy, who heard it from a family friend. I remember sitting in my truck outside our office when I got the text, staring at the steering wheel for maybe 3 minutes. Then I went back inside, because there was a client walk-through at 4 o'clock, and the business doesn't wait for old wounds. By then, Page & Co. Property Consulting had crossed $1 million in annual revenue. We'd added a design and renovation subsidiary. Troy had built the business plan for himself, 30 pages, financials, and market analysis included. We had employees who showed up every morning because they believed in what we were building, not because they owed anyone anything. Our accountant, not Diane, a different one, though I never stopped being grateful to Diane for the work she'd done, sat me down one Tuesday afternoon and told me our combined valuation had crossed $2.1 million. Renee stared at the number for a long moment. Dad, we're millionaires. I thought about the man who'd sat at that kitchen table 3 years earlier, hands shaking over a folder of bank statements, wondering if he'd ever trust anyone again. I barely recognized him anymore. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, my phone rang, a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. I let it go to voicemail and listened after. Cliff, it's Greg. A long pause, the kind that precedes the real reason for a call. I heard about what you built with Renee and Troy. I mean it. I'm proud of you. Another pause. Things have been hard. Real hard. The firm's gone. I'm doing freelance work, but it's not enough to cover. He stopped himself. I was wondering if Page & Co. had any need for someone with landscape design experience. Exterior staging, curb appeal, that kind of thing. I know it's a long shot. I had to ask. He had to ask. The man who spent 8 months quietly bankrolling his own affair with money drained from my retirement account. The man who sat across from me at dinner tables while it was happening, who was my son's godfather. He had to ask me for a job. I called him back. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been sitting there with a phone in his hand. Cliff, I listened to your message, I said. My voice was even. Not cold, just even. The way I'd learned to be in that mediation room 3 years earlier. And I'm going to be straight with you. The way I wish someone had been straight with me a long time ago. There's no place for you at my company. Not because I'm still angry. I'm honestly not anymore. But because the trust it takes to bring someone into what my children and I built is something you and Sandra spent a long time ago. And it doesn't come back because your business failed. Cliff, please. I don't have anywhere else. I hope you find your footing, Greg. I mean that, but it won't be here. I hung up. I sat in my truck in the parking lot outside our office for a few minutes, and then I went back inside because there was work to do, and I had gotten very good over 3 years at choosing the work over the wound. By the time our accountant confirmed the $2.1 million valuation, I'd stopped tracking Greg and Sandra's decline on purpose. I didn't need to. Ann Arbor is small enough that news finds you whether you go looking or not. I heard Greg's landscaping firm had quietly dissolved that same year. Staff let go before the holidays, commercial clients he'd never rebuilt after the pandemic gone for good. I heard Sandra was substitute teaching 3, sometimes 4 days a week in the same district where she'd once run curriculum development for the entire city. I heard they'd sold the house on Maiden Lane because they couldn't carry the payment anymore. I didn't feel triumphant hearing any of it. What I felt was quieter than that, something closer to recognition. Choices have weight. Some foundations just aren't built to hold what gets stacked on top of them. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. Life kept moving the way it does when you stop waiting for it to fall apart again. Renee hired a creative director. Troy signed a partnership with a materials supplier that would let us take on twice the renovation volume. I refinished the kitchen on Barton Shore Drive that fall. Troy designed it, I project managed it, and every time I stood in it, I thought about how far away that first morning felt. The cold coffee, the flat sentence about money. I'd built a life Sandra couldn't have imagined walking away from, and some nights that felt like enough of an ending on its own. Then, 2 weeks after I hung up on Greg for the last time, a plain white envelope showed up at our Eisenhower Parkway office. No return address. My name typed, not handwritten, across the front. The kind of typing that comes from a printer, not a person leaning over a desk with a pen. A receptionist set it on my desk with the rest of the afternoon mail, sandwiched between a vendor invoice and a renewal notice for our business insurance, and I almost didn't open it before a client call. I opened it between calls, half distracted, expecting a bill or a solicitation. Inside was a single photograph and a folded sheet of paper, blank except for the image on it. No note, no signature, no explanation. I set my coffee down before I even understood why my hand needed to be free of it. I looked at the photograph for a long time before I understood what I was looking at, and when I finally did, my stomach dropped the same way it had in Diane Okafor's office 3 years earlier, except this time, the numbers weren't the problem. The woman in the photograph wasn't Sandra.